The following message by Alistair Begg is made available by Truth for Life. For more information, visit us online at truthforlife.org.
Who's first? Give us your question, please.
I just thought it'd be fun for us to hear your comments a little bit about this renovation and your building, and just a little bit of information about why you did what you did. Okay?
All right, thank you very much. Do you like what we've done? Yeah. When I came in 1983, we had a building in another part of the city, and we sold it in 1986, and I was very excited when they said to me that they could get, they thought, I think it was 1.1 million for the sale of the building, to which I said, well, that's good because it gives us a very good start on what we're doing. They said, not so fast. We have a mortgage of $950,000 on the building. And it has a prepayment penalty clause of another $25,000. Well, I never had heard of such a thing in my life. Coming from Scotland, it never occurred to me. Scots and the Dutch, you know, and Hebrews are, we got it, and Swiss. So from that point on, when we built the first part of this building all the way through, it has been our objective, and God has helped us to make sure that we are not carrying any indebtedness whatsoever in any of these projects. Now, that demands certain things, and it's been a wonderful thing that the leadership has been united in this and led the charge. To have done what we've done, I don't know if you've gone through in the children's wing, but the children's wing that we built is really fantastic. And to whom much is given, much will be required, and that's on our hearts and a burden for us at the moment, because we need to do more than we've been doing so far, but it's not just so easy to do certain things. It's a team that does it. We're very well served in the congregation. We have one man who was a high level in a large building firm, who has been a constituent part of our church for many years along with his wife, and he was volunteering his time, and then he became full-time with us, and he has then led the charge through all of these things: the development of the venue, the refurbishing of the kitchen, the restoration of this room. And I really don't know what else to say about it. We did it because we felt it was for the future. In many ways, you know, I say to people somewhat facetiously, but seriously too, you know, I'm really setting this thing up for my replacement, so that there's no sense of, you know, personal anything really about it. It doesn't, don't misunderstand me when I say it doesn't mean that much to me, but it actually doesn't mean that much to me. I'm very grateful for it. But it's not, my identity is not engaged in it in any way at all, and I don't think anybody's really is. And so we've done it in this way so that in the future, as we proceed, it will be a more useful space. I've still got two pieces in my own personal puzzle left, and we've run out of money, and so it's a challenge. But I do want us to build a freestanding chapel on the property that will be suitable for weddings and funerals, maybe for 300 or 350 people, very simple. And I'm trying to convince the elders to put a graveyard in to the bottom of the property as well, so that we can say to the world that the church is the place where burials have routinely taken place, because the church is the only place that has an answer to the question of death. And so that's the next piece of the puzzle, if we're able to get there. Yep.
Kind of a funny question and then a serious one. The funny one is, some of us were commenting on that Truth for Life building, whether we might be able to live on the second floor. It looked very inviting.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes. But
that's
anyway,
that's the funny one?
I hope. Maybe I should have let you figure out whether that was the serious one, you know. So, what do you think is the your opinion, the most serious cultural question today that is a challenge for the church, and ways or suggestions that you've heard or that that this congregation has engaged in to try to graciously approach the situation, the challenge?
I think without doubt the whole issue of human sexuality and the nature of manhood and womanhood and the family and everything else. And I think, and I hope you'll accept this from me, I'm pretty certain that this will be a question tomorrow, because it almost it's a question every time. And I think it might be good just to leave it until tomorrow, because I'm sure it'll be addressed and we'll get it, as it were, in triplicate. I mean, I could speak about it a little bit, but if you don't mind, we could leave it until then. And if you would like to come up onto the second floor of the Truth for Life building when it's finished, I'll be glad to let you stay there overnight, just once.
We live in a world where we have social media with Twitter and blogs and Facebook and all kinds of other things, and we can use those as good tools to help us communicate with our folks, but there's also some dangers in that as well. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are with social media and the advantages and the dangers, pitfalls that we need to be aware of in that.
Well, I should really let some of my colleagues answer for me and safeguard me. Well, I personally, I'm not very good at that stuff, and I'm not in it. I don't have a Facebook page. I'm not on Instagram. It's really not possible to live in our world without this dimension. I just interviewed a young couple in preparation for their marriage. I asked them how they met. They met through social media. One of my good friends who's just moved back to the area, who was in Florida, who is now his wife, was in Michigan. I asked them how they met. They met through social media, through the engaging processes that are involved in that. It's difficult for us to conceive of the extent to which, for example, our radio program is carried exponentially to areas and in dimensions that I'm not even really cognizant of myself. At the same time, it's a bit like everything else, you know. The good that was represented in the printing press brought with it the challenges that it can be used because we live in a fallen world. So I'm not a fan of using social media for our Bibles and things like that. But I'm a Neanderthal. I mean, I'm old, and so I'm just rambling. I kind of like it, but not a lot, and I think the benefits outweigh the detriments, but I don't like this thing. I went on Facebook for a nanosecond because of Jeff, because he said that I could go on, so that we could keep in touch, that I could go on Facebook and it would be a closed Facebook page. Well, I went on it like for 47 seconds, only to realize that, yeah, it was closed in the sense that you couldn't get on it. But as soon as I went on it, then it opened up to every other part of that world. And I don't want that world. You know, I don't want that world. So yeah, I'm afraid of that world, really, I suppose. Yeah. Well, you know, that's old people applauding. Old, crusty old people like me. Yeah, no good, no good.
Sir, my question is, we're dealing with like prosperity gospel as a challenge, not the obvious Creflo Dollar, Paula White you'll make money, but more of the God loves you, he loves his people, you should have physical healing, you should expect it. If you're not proclaiming it, you're not proclaiming the gospel. Do you have a book recommendation that makes a positive case for who God in Christ is and against that, sir?
The Bible. I mean, that's really where we start. I mean, any of these questions, my good friend Sinclair Ferguson says, one of the questions you should always ask with this is, does this theory work with Jesus? And if it doesn't work with Jesus, it doesn't work. So, how can you propound this stuff on the back of the life and teaching of Jesus? You don't need anything other than that. I mean, that's it. In thinking of a book, I can't think of one off the top of my head. If any of my colleagues who are here know of a good book, they can call it out to me or get it to me, and then I can say it in a moment or two. But it's an easy throw, isn't it? Because it appeals to a sort of a very man-centered orientation. And I think at the beginning of 2 Corinthians 4, when Paul says, we're not those who are tampering with the gospel. We're not diluting the gospel. We're not distorting the gospel. I mean, Corinth as a city was filled with self-aggrandizement. I mean, as a culture, the display of wealth and the identification of prosperity and people erecting monuments to themselves. I mean, they were into selfies before we had selfies. And that had bled into the church in Corinth itself, which is why he has so much to say, as Don was saying last night, about boasting, because boasting was a constituent part of the Corinthian psyche. And it's a huge part of Western culture's psyche still today. And so I don't think it's so much for us to sort of rail against it, and I would think that you would agree with that, as much as it is for us then to try and, both in our teaching and in our lives, make the point that you're making. I'm sorry, I can't answer. I can't deal with a hand. It has to be whoever has the microphone. Yep, thanks.
I'm here with my friend. We're both missionaries. I'm a missionary to South Africa. Josh is a missionary to Malta. And I'm just wondering how Parkside structures their missions, foreign missions program. Could you speak to that?
Mm-hmm. When I came in 83, I discovered that we had lots and lots of missionaries. I didn't know how a church that had been so young had lots and lots of missionaries, because the church that I had been most recently a part of had very few missionaries and had been around a long time. But Charlotte Chapel, where I'd been the assistant, the missionaries were kind of carved into the board. And so they were all there. And there was a direct relationship with all of them. Well, then I discovered that what had happened was that someone came and said that they were a missionary somewhere and they would like some help. And so the church said, well, we could help you. And they gave him a little bit of support. Then another person and another person, another person. That's how you ended up with 35 or 40 or 50 of these people. But then I realized hardly anybody knew anybody. And the person would come into town and people would say, who's she? And they said, well, she's in the such and such with the so-and-so. And some well-meaning person had obviously said, why don't we have Brenda, in the thing? And we got them in the thing. Well, I'd never experienced this before, so I'm just processing it. 1986, I went to Kenya and to Liberia with a doctor in the church. And we went because Kep, who's here with us, Kep James, who's been in Bolivia for the last 100 years, was our youth pastor and was being tugged to missions. And one thought that SIM had was that they would send them to Elwa in Liberia. So we went to Liberia to find out, see if we could figure that out. Well, when I was there, I was with missionaries actually in a car, and they were from America, and I was driving in the car with them. And I think I was, saying something like, can we get out of this car soon? And because this is taking too long. And someone said, oh, well, you should have been with us when we were home on furlough. And then they said, we drove some outlandish number of miles. And I said, well, why did you do that? And they said, well, we had to go to all our supporting churches. I said, well, why doesn't one church support you? And they said, well, how can one church support you? I said, well, I don't know. I'm just asking. And so they said, well, no, that can't work. That's not how it works. I said, okay. So now fast forward, we come back. I'm here. I'm in a meeting with the leadership. Cap is going to go. He'll be our first guy launched into mission. And the elders, some of the guys said, he's going to have to go and raise his support. Well, I said, what do you mean? He said, well, you raise your support. You're a missionary. I said, you mean you got to get like a station wagon and a slide projector and start, driving up to church buildings and introducing yourself? Is that what you're talking about? Because that's crass, but that's essentially the game, right? So they said, well, no. I said, well, that's what you do. I said, well, no, that's not what we do. That can't be what we do. I said, we have been paying his salary, investing in his retirement while he's here as a youth pastor. Now, the fact that he goes to Bolivia, why does that change anything? They said, well, I said, no, this is what we do. You give him my salary in Bolivia and let me raise my support here in the congregation and anywhere else I could do it. Oh, no, they said, we're not doing that. Because that's risky. You've got a Scotsman with a name called Begg raising his own support. That's not going to work. So that's what we began. We pared down all the extraneous stuff, gradually finished 99% of it. There were some who were for different reasons who we were able to absorb, if you like. And then the next person that went, we operated on the same basis. And the next person. And in the goodness of God, we've been able to do that with all of the teams. So whether our most recent couple went to Japan, they're in Macedonia, the Yurkoviches, Kep and Debbie have been a lifetime in Bolivia. The Beans have just come home to us from Peru at the moment with Wycliffe. The Collinses are in Guatemala and in Peru, and so on. That's our philosophy. And that has given us control with the missionary organizations as well. So the missionary organizations can't tell our missionaries what they're going to do, because they're our missionaries. We are the sending church. The agency can be a conduit because they have expertise, but they cannot control the missionaries. So they can't, when we bring the missionaries home, we tell them, you stay home. You're not getting in a station wagon. You don't have to go anywhere. You don't need to go anywhere. And in the goodness of God, we've been able to we've bought 8 houses all around us here, which are missionary houses or help houses or whatever you want to call them. But so when our missionaries come home, then they come and they have a home, they have a car, they have a lifestyle. They don't have to go into all of that. And God's been really good to us. And somebody said, well, if you keep that going, you're going to end up spending, you'll have, $1 million or $2 million on that kind of stuff. I said, yeah. Yeah. I mean, you got, how many millions have you got in a building? So that's what we do. And we're a work in progress.
To your right, extreme right. Yeah. Given the openness to the gospel in many countries around the world that are truly hungry for good teaching but lack theological training, what do you believe our view should be as pastors? Do we stay here in these nice, wonderful conferences, or do we go where the need is desperate?
Well, if we all go, there'll be no conference, right? So some of us are going to have to stay. I'm planning on staying. You go if you want. Now, demythologizing that, there is no ideal place to serve God except the place He sets you down. Geography is almost a happenstance now. Our world is so small that the question of where we're actually serving has more to do with giftedness, opportunity, responsibility. I mean, what's a Scotsman doing for the majority of his life in Cleveland, Ohio, for crying out loud, right? Who's to know what that investment means, not only for the immediacy of Cleveland, but for whatever else extends beyond that? It would, if I had $1 for every time people say, well, why did you leave Scotland? You know, what's up? I hear Scotland's in dreadful shape. What are you doing here? Well, the answer is I'm here by God's appointment. If it was God's appointment to stay in Scotland, I would have stayed in Scotland and I would go back to Scotland. But I'm here. And so each of us has got to work out our own salvation with fear and trembling. And I think, quite honestly, that the notion of us, you know, going over to places, you know, to you know, share our genius with them is somewhat jingoistic and almost old-fashioned. I think I think if we live long enough without the return of Christ, we're going to have to face the fact that some of the best theological books are going to come out of Malaysia. They're going to come out of Africa. They're going to come out of the places. It's not going to be us writing the books to give to those folks. Those folks are going to be writing the books to give to us if it continues the way it is. So what I would like to see, and I'd like to see churches becoming, if you like, teaching module places, either via social media or supplemented by social media, where we have the opportunity, much like a teaching hospital, to bring people into our context and who are indigenous to places, who would enjoy the opportunity, who would benefit from it. And it's a twofold benefit because they then enrich us by our understanding of who they are, what they're doing, and how they're doing it. And we have the benefit of being able to support them from there. So when I think about all these rooms up the stairs, I imagine being able to go from the Greek room to the Egypt room to the Bolivia room to the Nigeria room and finding in there folks from all these different countries who we've had just some small part of being engaged in their lives, so that it's not all going to the vision trip in India, but also in a kind of reciprocal way. I'm rambling now, I apologize. But I say again, there's no ideal place to serve God except the place He sets you down. And we want to be sensitive to what that means. You know, the amount, there's a lot of people in Cleveland that they never heard the gospel. You know, they need Jesus badly. We haven't even scratched the surface here yet. Yes?
I have a practical witnessing question for you. I have 3 adult children that were all raised in a Christian home. 2 of them are wonderfully walking with the Lord. The third does not associate today with Christianity. When I have many in-depth discussions with him about the scriptures and about how God works, he asked me a question: why did not God initiate anything with me, Dad? I know how I responded. How would you respond?
I would say that He did initiate something with you. He gave you into our home. And we have been the voice of God in your ears. And we have been the prompting of God in our prayers. So you may not hear His voice, but you have been put in a position where His voice may be heard. And you know, our prayer in that context is that if you think about it, when you're small and you're asleep and you get wakened up by your parents, you don't know that they're waking you up to begin with. You then come slightly out of it and you hear there's a noise. And then you come even more out of it and you realize, I am being called by name. And then you realize they are calling me out of my sleep into life. And, in a situation like that, we're praying that individual who has grown up in that context will actually hear the voice of God call his name, But I think it's fair to say that when God entrusts children into the home of believing parents, that they have the peculiar benefit of being set up in a context where God has taken the initiative. He has taken the initiative in entrusting them to a God-fearing home. I don't know what else I would say. Yeah. I can only respond to you if you have a microphone. I'm sorry. Yeah.
For our brother in West Point, would you comment on books that you guys recommended earlier? Boyce's Whatever Happened to the Gospel of Grace and David Wells' Courage to be Protestant, in answer to his question about what about the health and wealth gospel.
Oh, that's good. That's good. There we go. Thanks, Bill. Yeah, The Courage to be Protestant by David Wells. And actually, John Piper has just done another little book called Sex, Money, and Power, hasn't he? I would think that would be very helpful as well. Thanks, Bill. It's good. Yep.
As a bivocational pastor, one of my biggest challenges is balancing my time so I can spend enough time in sermon preparation. So I have two questions for you. The first question is, how much time do you spend in sermon preparation? And the second question is, any advice for someone in my bivocational situation?
Yeah, it's good. Let's do it in reverse so I can decide whether I'm going to tell lies about the first question. What time do you have to go to work in your vocational charge? 7:30. 7:30.
So right now I get up at 4 a.m. to do my sermon preparation.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, if I had a hat, I'd take it off. Because that's what I was going to say. I mean, redeeming the earliest part of the day I find is the best. If I can't get it then, I convince myself I'm going to get it, and I seldom do. So I think you're probably on track. How about Saturdays?
Saturday morning I spend a few hours before noon. I can do that. Yeah.
Right. And do you preach once or twice on a Sunday?
Once.
Well, I would think, between 4 o'clock in the morning, let's say you even get 2 good hours. 5 days a week, 10 hours, and maybe 4 on a Saturday, 14. I would say that would be pretty good preparation. I would think that was good. The answer to the first part of the question of how much do I spend, as much as I possibly can is the answer. And it just depends on how a week unfolds. But Mondays are tough. Tuesday's a day off. Wednesday, depending on what happens with early morning meetings once a month and maybe sometimes another month, it's just a sheer discipline. In many ways, it was a lot easier for me when I was on my own in my church in Scotland, where I didn't have the benefits of all these other things or the distraction of all these other things. And then I was able to just say, in the morning, I get up, I get dressed, I put my shoes on, and I study. And I study till lunchtime, and then I go on from there. And I did that, with the only thing that broke it was a funeral or some crisis. And that way I had a far more cadenced and balanced existence than I do now. But an ideal week for me is that I would actually be ready by the end of a Friday so that I have Saturday as a gestation period. But Then the second best would be by lunchtime on a Saturday. And then third best would be by 6 on a Saturday. Fourth would be right around midnight on a Saturday. And fifth would be like by 7:30 on Sunday morning, you know. You're not supposed to tell people that you've come here under cover of darkness on a Sunday morning, but you've got to do the work. One way or another, you've got to do the work. You can't get by. You get by for a Sunday, maybe a Sunday and a half, but especially your congregation know you. You've got to do the work. And so, you know, I'm a slave to my own processes. You know, I write everything out by hand, and I'm not finished unless I've done that. So I don't allow myself the luxury of thinking that I can do without that, although certain times maybe I can, but it's an act of discipline. So I would commend you for what you're doing. I mean, I think it's that bivocational thing is a real challenge, and it's a wonderful thing. Maybe you get some people around you to set you free from the vocational part, huh? One more year. You could always get a station wagon and a slide projector.
First, as a former missionary who did 2 years of support raising in a subcompact car with a wife and 3 kids, God bless you. God bless your church. Secondly, it's been a small part of the conversation about the biblical counseling movement, and I'd just like to hear your perspective on that.
Well, did you manage to attend Jonathan Holmes' workshop? Yes?
A little bit of it.
A wee bit of it? All right. Well, Jonathan would be the best person to answer that. My first exposure to it was when I made an abortive attempt at some study at Westminster Theological Seminary, and then I was exposed to it then. Actually, before that, when I came to America, having read J. Adams and Competent to Counsel, I was very intrigued to meet J. Adams, which I did at Westminster Seminary when I was still probably just 20 or 21. And I don't know quite how to answer the question, except that insofar as, you know, Jonathan, in giving his talks here, represents our entree into that world, which I think we're into the best parts of it, then I'm immensely thankful for it. If there are vagaries in relationship to it, of which I'm unaware, then I can't comment on those things.
What has helped you stay faithful and keep your zeal for God and His people over the long haul in ministry?
Well, lots of things. Fear. The fear of God. Being in a context where the people around me have been more than gracious and kind to me, both by their prayers, their encouragement, their counsel. They don't know that I always listen to what they're saying, but I actually listen to more than I want them to even know that I do. I'm helped by a wife who is prayerfully and quietly supportive of me. I've been helped by having 3 children who don't cut me any slack at all, and who love me, but I'm their dad, and they're very quick to let me know when it didn't really sound like a pleasant word from the pastor. The people who have been the influences on my life remain influences on my life from a distance and even from the grave. I was saying to somebody yesterday, it's difficult for me to fiddle around or shilly-shally with things when the photographs around me in my room are sort of watching me. And so the man that I was assistant to, Derek Prime, When if I think about something I was about to say or about to do or I could do or whatever else, and I always say, I wonder how that would play with him. And there are other men like that as well. And so I think I'm kept in that way. And just the sheer discipline of the responsibilities of pastoral ministry that make us aware of our own frailty, that make us aware of our own ongoing need. That I thought that by this time, preaching would be like, I wouldn't say easy, but I thought, well, once you've done it for 40 years, you should be able to just go. But now I realize, in many ways, I'm less confident and more diffident than I was when I was foolish, half my age. And it's a strange thing. I think we got time maybe just for one more. It's 8:56.
In what ways have you recently been hearing from God, is the first question. If you wouldn't mind sharing, what is he teaching you recently in your personal time, whether it's in study or walks or however he communicates with you? And then thirdly, why do you think he's teaching you that right now?
Okay. Well, I can answer that very straightforwardly. He's teaching me from the book of Ephesians primarily, because I'm teaching the book of Ephesians. And I am being taught by the book that I'm teaching. I believe that we're studying it together as a church because it is right for us to study it at this time. I wouldn't argue that it is more right to study this than to study the book of Hebrews necessarily, but in the unfolding of just the way of church life, and having finished Daniel, it seemed right to go to the New Testament again. And since we had never studied Ephesians together as a church, and I was being urged to by some of my colleagues, I said, okay, then I'll take it on. I didn't really want to take on the doctrine of election, but I couldn't start Ephesians without dealing with it. And so God has been teaching us about the immensity of his grace and goodness, about the incomparable nature of his power, about the wonder of his purposes for us as a church, big C, and as a church, small c. And so I don't have any special or peculiar track beyond that. I don't look for it in my own reading, going through Truth for Life's daily readings at the moment, through the book of Song of Solomon. I guess he might have had a special word for me there. Probably missed that one. In Hebrews, the apostasy passages jump out and so on. But I think that's my honest answer. Ultimately Jesus is the preacher. He preaches through his word by the Holy Spirit, and so I'm on the receiving end of my own teaching, and so it's a strange thing, isn't it? Doing that. People say, well, who do you listen to? I listen to myself mainly. And if you think it's bad once, you ought to try doing it 3 times in a row. And but it's God's word, so it's not about you. So those are the things. What God has for us in the book of Ephesians at the moment is where my heart is, where my study is, and I hope that I am. I hope that the word of God is coming home to my own heart, so that it's from my heart to the hearts of the congregation, rather than just to my head and then to the heads of the congregation. All right, it's 9 o'clock on the nose. Thank you very much. And I'd like to finish by singing a song, but I'm not going to do that. No, it was a joke. But I want to give you my favorite Spurgeon quote for the present time. Okay? Someone gave this to me in Spokane, Washington, and I've been really enjoying it. And this is an encouragement to us in our preaching responsibilities, and then we'll pray. This is what he says. Whatever you may know, you cannot be truly efficient ministers if you're not apt to teach. You know ministers who have mistaken their calling and evidently have no gifts for it. Make sure that none think the same of you. There are brethren in the ministry whose speech is intolerable. Either they rouse you to wrath, or else they send you to sleep. No anesthetic can ever equal some discourses in sleep-giving properties. No human being, unless gifted with infinite patience, could long endure to listen to them. And nature does well to give the victim deliverance through sleep. I heard one say the other day that a certain preacher had no more gifts for the ministry than an oyster. And in my own judgment, this was a slander on the oyster. For that worthy bivalve shows great discretion in his openings and knows when to close. If some men were sentenced to hear their own sermons, it would be a righteous judgment upon them. And they would soon cry out with Cain, "My punishment is greater than I can bear." Brethren, let us not fall under the same condemnation. And this was Spurgeon's way of encouraging his students. And scaring the rest of us to death. Well, we commend each other to God's care. Now, may the Lord bless us and keep us. May the Lord make his face to shine upon us and be gracious to us. May the Lord lift up the light of his countenance upon us and give us his peace tonight and forevermore. Amen.
This message was brought to you from Truth for Life, where the learning is for living. To learn more about Truth for Life with Alistair Begg, visit us online at truthforlife.org.